The US dollar isn't just a currency, it's a weapon of influence, a tool of control, a leash on the global economy. But here's what most people never realize. The dollar didn't rise to dominance through free market brilliance or economic virtue. Its throne was built in secrecy through a series of hidden agreements with oil-rich kingdoms that linked the world's energy supply to American paper. That network became known as the petrodollar system. It's the invisible foundation of U.S. financial power, the reason America can print endless money while other nations crumble under debt, and the reason so many wars have erupted in distant deserts. Many believe the dollar earned its supremacy. The truth is, it was carefully engineered. To see where the petrodollar truly began, we have to rewind to the aftermath of World War II. In 1944, with Europe shattered and economies in ruins, the United States gathered world leaders in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 700 delegates from 44 nations met to design a new global financial system. Their agreement was historic. The US dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency, fixed at $35 for every ounce of gold. Other countries would tie their currencies to the dollar, while America guaranteed that anyone holding dollars could exchange them for gold from its treasury. For years, the system worked perfectly. The United States possessed the largest gold reserves, its economy was dominant, and its currency carried the strength of solid metal. Nations trusted the dollar because it wasn't just paper, it was backed by something real. By the 1960s, the foundations of the dollar system were beginning to crack. Washington was spending far beyond its means, funding the costly Vietnam War abroad and massive social programs at home under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. To cover the shortfall, the Federal Reserve printed more dollars, flooding the global economy with paper that far outpaced America's gold reserves. Foreign nations, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, started to lose patience. They began demanding real gold in exchange for their growing piles of US dollars. Gold reserves drained from the American vaults, and the illusion of stability started to crumble. Then came August 1971. President Richard Nixon addressed the nation and declared a so-called temporary end to the dollar's convertibility into gold. Overnight, the dollar became pure paper backed not by metal, but by trust in the U.S. government. The world was thrown into uncertainty. If the dollar was no longer anchored to gold, why should anyone keep using it? The entire global financial system stood on the brink of collapse. Just as the dollar's foundation was shaken, another crisis struck. In 1973, Arab members of OPEC launched an oil embargo to punish the United States for supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Overnight, oil prices exploded, quadrupling within months. Gas stations in America saw lines stretching for miles. Europe struggled with shortages, and the world's major economies faced a harsh new reality. Energy was no longer just another trade good, it was the bloodline of modern civilization. And whoever held control over oil prices held control over the future. This is where the hidden arrangements began to shape the world. Washington recognized a lifeline. If gold could no longer anchor the dollar, perhaps oil could take its place. Henry Kissinger, serving as Nixon's Secretary of State, opened quiet negotiations with Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil producer on earth and the powerhouse of OPEC. The deal they forged was as simple as it was world-changing. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars. Every nation, whether Japan, France, or Germany, would have to use dollars to buy Saudi crude. In return, the United States pledged to defend the Saudi kingdom, provide advanced military hardware, and protect the royal family from external threats or internal uprisings. But there was one more condition, one that sealed America's dominance. The Saudis agreed to reinvest their enormous oil profits, their petrodollars, back into the U.S. financial system, purchasing treasury bonds and depositing funds in American banks. This agreement, quietly finalized in 1974, was never voted on, never debated, never publicly acknowledged. It was an unspoken pact between two powers, and it changed everything. Not long after, other OPEC nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. Oil across the globe became priced exclusively in US dollars. And just like that, the petrodollar system was born. This new structure didn't just reshape trade, it redefined global power. Any nation that needed oil, which meant every nation, now needed US dollars first. Demand for the dollar became permanently woven into the world economy. Even countries hostile to Washington were forced to hold and trade in the very currency they resented. The dollar was no longer backed by gold reserves, it was now backed by something far more vital, the energy that powered the modern world. Once the agreement with Saudi Arabia was sealed, the mechanism became self-sustaining. Every barrel of oil traded anywhere on Earth, from the sands of the Middle East to the coasts of Africa and South America, had to be priced in US dollars. Whether it was Japan fueling its industries, Germany powering its factories, or India keeping its lights on, every nation now needed a steady supply of American currency. Holding dollars was no longer a choice. It was a requirement for survival in the modern world. Global demand for the dollar became constant, automatic, and universal. The dollar stopped being just America's money. It evolved into the world's default operating system. The brilliance of this arrangement wasn't just in creating demand, it was in how the dollars cycled back. Oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Gulf states found themselves overflowing with cash. Their domestic economies were too small, too underdeveloped to absorb the flood of income pouring in from oil exports. So where did all that money go? Straight back to the United States. They bought treasury bonds, placed deposits in Wall Street banks, and extended their influence across the globe. Petrodollars earned abroad returned home, quietly fueling the U.S. financial system. The result was extraordinary. America gained an almost limitless credit supply. It could fund huge budget deficits, pour money into the Cold War, and sustain its global influence, all without the dollar losing strength. The system itself guaranteed endless demand for both the currency and America's debt. Wall Street quickly joined the feast. American banks became the key brokers in the petrodollar cycle, managing Saudi investments, channeling oil profits into loans, and extending their influence across the globe. Trillions in oil revenue flowed through their accounts, flooding the financial system with liquidity. During the 1970s and 1980s, these banks began lending that surplus to developing nations, especially in Latin America. Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina borrowed heavily to fund modernization and industrial growth. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. The borrowers built infrastructure, the lenders earned interest, and oil producers made steady returns. But when Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker sharply raised interest rates in the early 1980s to combat inflation, the illusion collapsed. Debt repayments skyrocketed overnight, crushing national budgets. Mexico defaulted in 1982, and soon the entire region was engulfed in crisis. The result was a lost decade, marked by IMF austerity programs, collapsing economies, and widespread unrest. None of it was accidental. It was the hidden consequence of the petrodollar framework, where profits flowed to New York and London, while the pain was exported to the developing world. The petrodollar didn't just empower the dollar, it weaponized it. Oil revenues made the U.S. currency stronger, and that strength gave Washington and Wall Street enormous leverage. Countries trapped in debt had to keep earning dollars to survive. To pay interest, they were forced to sell raw materials, oil, and food, all priced in markets dominated by the very powers that held their debt. It was a system that funneled wealth upward, concentrating financial control in the hands of creditor nations, especially the United States. For the rest of the world, it meant dependency, austerity, and submission. It was colonialism reborn, not through armies or flags, but through money and debt. For Washington, the rewards were extraordinary. Through the petrodollar system, the United States secured what French leaders once labeled an exorbitant privilege, the unmatched power to borrow endlessly in its own currency. Massive government deficits no longer posed the same danger, because the rest of the world needed US dollars and treasury bonds to function. Inflation that would have wrecked another country's currency was quietly exported abroad, absorbed by global demand for dollars. This privilege allowed the U.S. to fund huge wars, sustain welfare programs, and dominate world finance without facing the usual consequences. It also gave Washington the ultimate weapon, control of the global financial system itself. The U.S. could freeze assets, impose sanctions, or cut nations off entirely, all because energy, the very lifeblood of civilization, was chained to its currency. This wasn't the invisible hand of the free market at work. It was a carefully engineered monopoly, constructed behind closed doors, protected by power. And make no mistake, this system was not voluntary. It was enforced. Any nation that dared to challenge the dollar's supremacy quickly discovered the cost.
In 2000, Iraq under Saddam Hussein began selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. Just 3 years later, U.S. forces invaded Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction, though many noted the convenient timing. A decade later, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed creating a gold-backed dinar for African oil trade. By 2011, NATO bombs were falling on Tripoli, and Gaddafi was gone. Iran, too, has long sought to sell oil outside the dollar system, and in return, it has faced decades of crippling sanctions and isolation. Officially, these actions were framed as matters of national security or human rights, but beneath the rhetoric, the message was unmistakable. The challenge the petrodollar is to challenge the core of American power, and those who try do not last long.
The genius and cruelty of the petrodollar system was that it didn't need public approval or formal ratification. No global votes, no visible treaties, just quiet understandings and unspoken consequences. The deal between Washington and Riyadh was never discussed in Congress, never printed in school textbooks, and never aired on the evening news. Yet, it shaped the lives of billions. It determined the price of gas in Europe, the interest rates in Asia, and the debt burdens of nations across Africa and Latin America. Oil became the unseen pillar holding up the dollar, while the dollar itself turned into an invisible global tax, one paid by every country that needed to keep the lights on. For nearly half a century, the petrodollar order appeared untouchable. It endured recessions, wars, and financial upheavals, always emerging stronger. But history has a way of eroding even the mightiest systems. And now, the fractures are beginning to show. China, the largest buyer of oil on Earth, is increasingly settling energy deals in its own currency, the yuan. Russia, locked out of the dollar network by Western sanctions, now trades oil with Asia using rubles and yuan. And even Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the original 1970s pact, has hinted it may accept non-dollar payments for oil, a subtle move with enormous implications. These changes won't dethrone the dollar overnight, but each transaction conducted outside its reach weakens the foundation of an empire built on petrodollars and preserved through power. The implications are enormous. If oil trading begins to move away from the dollar, the built-in global demand that has supported U.S. power for decades starts to fade. Without that automatic need for dollars, Washington's ability to borrow cheaply, export inflation, and use its currency as a geopolitical weapon begins to weaken. In a future where oil and energy are priced in a mix of currencies, yuan, euros, rubles, or even digital tokens, the dollar becomes just another competitor, not the uncontested ruler. For a nation that has built its prosperity on limitless credit and endless debt, that shift isn't just inconvenient, it's existential. But this kind of empire doesn't fall overnight. The petrodollar network is deeply embedded in global trade, banking systems, reserve holdings, and energy contracts. Untangling it won't happen in a single crisis or a single year. It will unwind gradually, piece by piece. We're already seeing the signs. Energy deals settled in yuan, gold being used in cross-border swaps, and digital currencies rising as new channels for trade. Each step chips away at the monopoly that once seemed eternal. Ironically, the very system that gave America its exorbitant privilege is now turning against it. Built on secrecy and quiet bargains, it lacks the one thing that could have made it last: the trust and consent of the people who live under it. To most people, this story sounds distant, something for diplomats and oil barons, not everyday life. But the truth is, the petrodollar touches everything. It explains why inflation hits different countries in different ways, why financial tremors in Washington ripple instantly through markets in Europe, Asia, and South America. When the U.S. Federal Reserve changes interest rates, your mortgage in Berlin, your rent in Buenos Aires, and your grocery bill in Manila all feel the impact. It explains why conflicts so often erupt in oil-rich regions, and how economic sanctions can bring nations to their knees without a single missile being launched. The petrodollar isn't just a system of money, it's a system of control, quietly shaping the world you live in every single day. And that brings us to the core truth. Money is never neutral. It is always a tool of power. The worth of your savings, the cost of your fuel, and the independence of your country's policies are often determined by agreements made behind closed doors. In 1974, American leaders and Saudi royals
forged a deal that rewired the global economy. No votes, no headlines. Just an understanding that turned oil into the backbone of the dollar's dominance. Since then, the world has lived under its shadow. But no shadow lasts forever. History reminds us that every monetary empire eventually falls. The gold standard did, and so will the petrodollar. Its decline won't be polite or gradual. It will be abrupt, violent, and irreversible. That's why understanding money isn't optional, it's survival. Because if you still believe the dollar's reign is permanent, you're already standing on thin ice. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of the petrodollar is clear. Hidden deals build mighty empires, until the day they crack. Those who see it coming adapt. Those who don't get buried beneath it. If this opened your eyes, subscribe, because history doesn't lie, it warns.